All right, so I'm gonna talk to you guys a little bit about sustainable weight loss. Like Patrick mentioned, I used to weigh over 300 pounds myself. My background is in something called dietetics, which is like clinical nutrition. I also have a degree in exercise science. My whole life I was overweight. I struggled with food pretty much my whole life, like a lot of people. We tend to, at a young age, relate eating to emotion, whether it's positive, negative. If we're sad, we tend to go to ice cream. If we get good grades, our parents take us out to eat. When we graduate, we go out to eat. So we start to tie a lot of these things to emotion. When I was 20 years old, I got diagnosed as pre-diabetic. And that was kind of like a wake-up call for me. It was like they basically told me, if you don't change something pretty quick here, you're gonna be full-blown diabetic and you are going down the wrong path. So I dropped out of culinary school and I entered dietetics, which is like clinical nutrition. I realized that most dietitians pretty quickly work in hospitals, eating disorder clinics. I wanted to help other regular people and teach them what I had learned in school myself, which goes, like Patrick mentioned, completely against what most people teach nowadays. So it's kind of interesting. One of the reasons that losing weight and keeping it off tends to be so hard is because there is so much misinformation out there. Especially today, you go online and you click on one thing and it says, you know, this is the reason why you're overweight, this is what you need to do, this is the diet you need to follow. You go to the next page, it says what the last page said was completely wrong and this is what you need to do, right? And you start to get confused and you try all these things and they don't immediately work and you see these results that they're purporting, right? That you should be seeing this result, you should be seeing this. And you start to think after a while, like maybe I'm just supposed to be a little bit overweight. These are things like keto and carnivore and paleo, which I'm sure we've all tried. I've tried all of them. When you're overweight, you really are just looking for anything that's going to solve that, no matter what it may be. This starts to lead people down pathways of extreme dieting, which can lead to eating disorders, and often, like Patrick mentioned, leads to yo-yo dieting, where we're essentially having to choose between living the life that we want to enjoy, going on vacations during the summer with the family, going out to eat, taking clients out to dinner, or being on a regimented meal plan that doesn't allow us to do anything when we go out to eat. I kind of take my job, and I work with a couple hundred people around the country now. And then like Patrick mentioned, I've had Transform for almost 10 years now, which is a private gym in Scottsdale that specializes in weight loss, kind of like The Biggest Loser, but almost like a destination in Scottsdale. And one of the major issues, like I mentioned, is they lack sustainability. So you think about keto, you think about carnivore, you think about low carb, period. It's not gonna work for the rest of your life, right? You're not going to avoid eating carbs. You're not gonna turn down every slice of birthday cake. You're not gonna go out to dinner with the client and say, sorry, I can't have a roll. You're not gonna turn all these things down. And what we found was that people tend to gain weight in the period of November and December, and then in social situations. And outside of that, outside of those periods, people don't really gain weight. So if whatever diet we're following, whether it's, you know, paleo, keto, carnivore, gluten-free, even if we don't have celiacs, it's probably not gonna work very long. You might see extreme results, but then as soon as those results stop, you're gonna jump to something new. And this is exactly what Patrick mentioned, where people just essentially yo-yo. And they go back and forth between having fun, going on vacation. We've all been on the flight when we're on our way back from vacation saying, oh, we need to get back on the diet plan, we need to get back on track. My goal and what I do for people, for my private clients, and then what the people at my gym do, is we teach people to kind of break down their lifestyle, break down their habits, and find that sustainability. So believe it or not, as he said, the answer for the majority of people is more carbohydrates. The ironic part is if I were presenting to a room of dietitians and I proposed a low carb diet for weight loss, I would be laughed out of the room. It is one of the silliest things you can do to lose actual body fat. It does a number on your metabolic rate. It makes it harder for you to sustain muscle. You don't have as much energy. And most importantly, it is not sustainable because again, we can't avoid carbs for the rest of our life. So if we only learn how to lose weight and get the weight off eating a low carb diet, how are we ever supposed to keep the weight off when we want to live a normal life again? The other advantage to eating a diet higher in carbs and protein and really watching your fat intake, like Patrick said, he's always been in pretty good shape. He exercised, he still had cholesterol issues, right? What has happened is over the last 20 years, and you'll see this on the next slide, is in my field of dietetics, something called the great nutrient transition has happened. And a lot of you guys might remember the 80s and 90s when we were making potato chips with Olestra and things like that, right? We were afraid of fat. Now the narrative has completely switched and we are afraid of sugar and carbohydrates. And what's really interesting, if you guys take a look at the graph that's on the screen there, is that in the year 2000, there was a really famous paper published and it examined carbohydrates, high fructose corn syrup, and sugar. And it is one of the most heavily and widely cited nutritional research papers in history. And what it showed was that there was a very strong correlation between sugar intake, high fructose corn syrup, and carbohydrates as a whole, and obesity. And when this got published is when Atkins and keto and paleo and things along those lines really started to take off. Now we have carnivore, which is the more extreme version of all of those. But what's interesting is you'll see this goes through about 25 years. The more recent, 2014 through 2022, shows an even greater decline in carbohydrates, to the point that the research we look at as of last year, as of 2022, we have the highest number of people overweight and obese, not necessarily just obese, but people who are like, I'm 15, 20 pounds overweight and I just can't seem to get it off. My cholesterol is higher than what it normally is. And what has happened is we have started taking in a significant amount more fat to replace the sugar and carbohydrates that we're no longer taking in. This is a combination of the connotation with fats becoming a positive one. We now think of, you know, if we're gonna drizzle olive oil all over our veggies, we think like, oh, it's good for our heart, it's good for, you know, it's good for health, but we don't really realize we're drizzling hundreds and hundreds of calories on top of whatever it is that we're having that may have only been 50 or 100 calories of vegetables in the first place. The same thing happens at restaurants. Because of this, food chemists, restaurateurs, all the people in the industry who create the food that we consume have started to shift things. So if you look at packaging, marketing even, everything now says no high fructose corn syrup, no sugar, keto, low carb, right? So we are now actually, as of 2022, consuming the lowest number of carbohydrates that we have ever consumed since we started tracking in the late 70s. And we simultaneously have the highest rate of overweight and obese individuals in the country. So if you think about that for a moment, we have the lowest carb intake that we've ever had, and we are the heaviest that we've ever been. So we actually have now created an inverse correlation between sugar and carb intake and obesity, because we just simply don't look at the calories, we don't look at the fatty acids, we just look and see, oh, is it low in carb? Oh, is it low in sugar? Okay, I'll eat it. And because of that, you can take a look at this graph right here. This is what's called a satiety graph, and it essentially measures how satiated people get from different foods. And this might surprise a lot of people. If you look at the two center portions of the graph, those are all carbohydrates. So if you see that first line going down the graph, what they essentially do in satiety studies is they give everybody a certain amount of food. And then they wait and see how many minutes that amount of food keeps people full for. So in this example, they gave everyone, 200 calories of all of these different foods. And then they waited to see how many minutes people stayed full for, right? And you can see that the two sections in the middle, every single item at least made it to the first line. Those are all carbohydrates. Even things that we would think of as more simple carbohydrates, like white bread and pasta and, you know, different things along those lines, cornflakes, jelly beans, crackers, they all at least made it that far, right? It's not until we start adding fat to the food down on the bottom where you see the lowest level of satiety, where people become hungry the fastest again. When we start adding in fats to things like donuts and chocolate bars and cakes, or if you even examine the peanuts, they're not even making it as far as the jelly beans. And that's because if you think about it, nuts are incredibly calorically dense. For those of you who don't know, fats contain more than double the amount of calories as proteins and carbohydrates. So if you eat the same amount, you get less than half the food. So your stomach becomes significantly less full right? If I give you, one slice of bread for 100 calories and I give you another slice of bread for 100 calories, or I take one slice of bread and I spread 100 calories of butter on it and I put it in my stomach, who's going to stay full longer? The person who ate double the amount of food, right? And that's one of the biggest issues, is that when people eat significantly high fat diets, they don't get a lot of satiety in return. So that's the main driver behind what has happened. And we've actually seen a faster increase from 2000 to 2020 than what we saw from 1980 to 2000, when we thought that carbohydrates and sugars were to blame. This is just a little bit more. Obviously, if there had been a direct causal relationship between sugar, carbohydrates, high fructose corn syrup, you would not see the study looking like this. When we dropped consumption of high fructose corn syrup, carbs, and sugar, we would have seen a drop in obesity. But all that started to happen was we started to replace it with fatty acids, and because they take up so little volume, a lot of people don't realize that. For those of you who know the little travel-sized tin of Blue Diamond almonds, like the small one, has more calories than 2 Big Macs. Now, the point of that is not to go out and get you to try and eat 2 Big Macs. The point is, in the same way that we understand health, we need to understand total calorie intake, total fat intake, because that's what's doing a lot of people in, both internally and externally as well. So that brings me back to the internal side of things and kind of what Patrick talked about with his cholesterol, right? Because that's one of the most important things. It's great to look good, it's great to feel good, it's great to be able to do things with your kids, be able to perform, have a functional body that doesn't hurt. But we also want to be healthy. We want to live long lives. And one of the most important things to you guys, obviously, is the longevity and the health of the individuals who you're working with. So being able to see a decrease in cholesterol, being able to see an improvement in lipid profiles, being able to see a reduction in BMI, these are all things that underwriters are going to look at, right, when they take things into account for life insurance policies or whatever else it may be. So the healthier that you can get the individuals you're working with to be, the lower their own premiums are going to be, and the better overall. Obviously, it's better for everyone's health, but the better overall result, not only the company, but the individual is going to end up having. It is important to note that different macronutrients play different roles within the body, and they make it, as I mentioned, easier or harder to sustain weight loss, right? If we're eating more carbohydrates, we're going to stay more full. We're not going to overeat as much. Since I started doing this, I've worked with over 1,500 private individuals just like Patrick. I've had the gym for almost 10 years. I have in my entire life had 2 people come in who are over consuming carbohydrates, and they both were over 500 pounds and had a soda addiction. Every single other person that I have worked with is overeating fatty acids. And this is something that we usually come to a conclusion of once we start to examine their diet. Just like with financials, right? Just like if somebody was going to come in and audit your financials, they would take a look at what you're doing. And that's how I work with clients, is I go in, and rather than telling them to change their whole diet right off the bat to something that's probably not going to stay their diet, right? Those old things are going to creep their way back into the pantry. I use the first 1 or 2 weeks as sort of an audit to collect data, right? Because I need to see, what are you doing now that we need to modify, and how can I teach you to modify that thing in a way that fits your lifestyle? If you're flying all over the country meeting clients, you're going to be going out to dinner. So how do we navigate going out to dinner? How do we navigate meals like that? And I kind of do that for my one-on-one clients on a pretty specific basis. Like, we get into the nitty-gritty of, like, all right, you're going to Capital Grille tonight. Here's how we're going to navigate that, right? And then the cool thing is, once we've navigated something like that a singular time, you know exactly how to get what you want at the steakhouse every single time, and you learn how to avoid some of the biggest pitfalls that come with eating out and just eating in general, right? So diets high in total fat, and especially saturated fat or trans fat, are going to lead to higher levels of LDL cholesterol, right? Which is bad cholesterol. This is what we don't want to see when we're writing life insurance policies for people, is elevated levels of cholesterol. They also lead to a significant increase in the risk of heart attacks and strokes, so factors of morbidity. And we also find people who exceptionally reduce their fiber intake, which is usually the individuals who are eating higher fat diets, also have a negative effect on heart health, because fiber directly helps to decrease cholesterol. It also helps keep us full, so we tend to not eat as much food, so we tend to also lose body fat, decreasing our BMI if that's something that we needed to do. So this just kind of gives you a little brief example of the difference in satiety, and this might surprise a lot of people. So this shows you how much food equates to different calories, right? So a tablespoon of all oil is the same number of calories. A leveled off tablespoon is going to be about 125, 130 calories, right? Whereas you think of something like a pound of red potatoes, if you don't add any butter, you don't add any sour cream, is only going to be 250 calories. If you put a pound of potatoes in your stomach, you're going to be pretty full, right? The problem is that we tend to add a lot of fats to these foods, and that's where the issue starts to come. Just like the satiety graph that you saw, where all of the things down at the bottom were the combination of carbs and fats together, because the satiety just isn't there. We eat it and all of a sudden we're hungry again. Not to mention it's highly palatable, so we tend to want to eat more of it. Even things like a clamshell of blackberries, an entire package is only 100 calories, right? Because it's carbohydrates, they're going to be much more voluminous. We get a lot of fiber out of them. So starting to shift our diet away from this exceptionally high fat diet that everyone seems to be pushing right now, especially people on the fitness side of the field, not people on the dietetic side of the field. And that's something else to be aware of. A lot of people who I sit down with are like, well, you're telling me the opposite of everything my trainer told me. And I'm always like, well, tell your trainer to go into a room full of dietitians. It's much different. When you go through dietetics, there's not a single course on exercise. It is 4 years of nothing but human nutrition, clinical nutrition, so you really get a good understanding of how the human body processes nutrients. You see there even the slice of bread, things like that. A lot of that stuff surprises people. How do we avoid the excess fats? That's kind of the obvious question, right? Because I'm harping on fats so much here. They add up so quickly. There are 2 places that I have found in all the people I've worked with that they tend to consume excess amounts of fat. The first place is going to be at restaurants. Okay, restaurants use a ridiculous amount of oil and fat in their cooking. I'll show you guys some examples of just how many calories are in some pretty traditional restaurant items, and it is going to shock you. The reason for this is, as somebody who has worked in 5 kitchens my life, there is no can of spray in the back of the kitchen. There is no Teflon. It's all cast iron skillets. It's all flat top grills that they're cooking everything on, right? So if you picture a piece of fish or you picture some potatoes they're going to chop up, what do they have to do every single time before any ingredient goes down? They're going to do a quick little squirt of oil, or they're going to do a little pat of butter, right? And if you do 1, 2, 3, 4 tablespoons at 130 calories, shit, I mean, you're over 500 calories right there, right? And you just added that to the food. So you're not getting any food volume in return for that. So you've taken in extra calories, but you're not any more full. If you start to think about how much additional food you could have had in the form of a carbohydrate or a protein source, you start to realize, I just gave up 400 calories and I didn't really get anything back for it, right? So I kind of train people in the opposite direction. What I've found is that most people, for the most part, understand healthfulness versus things that are unhealthy, right? What they lack is understanding how many calories they're really taking in and what their energy balance looks like, right? It would be like if you were losing money and you called up somebody to come audit your company, and you're like, hey man, I'm supposed to be, losing this much, but I'm only losing this much. He's gonna need to go in and look at those things, and my job is to identify the places where the excess fats are coming in that you guys don't really care about as individuals. Like, oh, I didn't even realize that those Kind bars I was eating were so much fat. Or, hey, I didn't even realize that this was adding up so much. So we then go in and examine that data, and I start essentially working with people to say, okay, what of these things would you be okay giving up? And we start to eliminate the things that people didn't really know we're doing them in, and we keep the things in there that you enjoy, that are part of your lifestyle. If you're like, hey man, there's no way around it, I'm gonna be at a steakhouse 2 nights a week, then we need to learn and teach you how to navigate being at a steakhouse 2 nights a week, right? So that's place number 1, is at restaurants. Place number 2 is the use of added oil at home, right? So we've all roasted up like a sheet pan of vegetables, right? And if we do broccoli or we do asparagus or something that's only, 25 calories, 30 calories a cup, we can get an entire sheet pan, put some balsamic vinegar on there, some salt and pepper. It's 100 calories for the whole sheet pan. So you and your significant other are gonna split it. You're gonna get a 50-calorie side each. But you decide to reach for that bottle of fancy EVOO that you got when you were in Tuscany last summer, and you do a quick drizzle over your asparagus, right? And you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you drizzle 6 little tablespoons, which is not hard to do out of one of those spouts, right? And you take 6 times 130, you got 780, it's almost 800. So you just added 800 calories to your 100 calorie sheet pan. Now, while extra virgin olive oil might be entirely healthy for the inside of your body, you just turned your 50 calorie side dish that each you and your significant other were gonna have into a 100 or 450 calorie side dish. And if you start to think about how much broccoli or how much asparagus would have had to stack up for that same amount of food, you realize that you're not really getting the bang for your buck when you're doing things like this, right? Not to mention the fats that are found in all of those oils, avocado oil, extra virgin olive oil, all of those things are omega-6 and omega-9 fatty acids, which are all fully saturated. That's what most of us consume in most of the other places in our diet. Meaning for the average American, they would not be considered a healthy fat. We already have plenty of omega-6s and 9s. So we don't need to then add more thinking that we're doing something. All that we're really doing is increasing the total number of calories and the total amount of fat that we're taking in, even if it's not an unhealthy form of fat. So here you see a couple of examples I mentioned from the restaurants. These usually surprise people. I used Capital Grille since it's a pretty generic chain restaurant. We have done studies on chain restaurants before and the nutritional information they provide. And across the industry, they underestimate their calories by 25%. That's the average. And we've had studies where they find items up to 200 to 300% different from the nutritional menu online. So for all of my individual clients who I work with, when they do track their food, which I require everybody to at least at the beginning, so again, I can get an idea of where things are going wrong, everything needs to go in by 1.25 servings. So that's why you see the 1.25 servings there. But if you look at these two things, one of them is a single side dish. For those of you who have been to Capital Grille, you know they have the big shareable sides and they have the individual sides. That is an individual side of mashed potatoes. Okay, if you look at the percentages of where the calories are coming from, there are 70% of the calories coming from fat in their mashed potatoes. Now, these mashed potatoes don't have bacon, they don't have cheese on top of them, but as somebody who worked in Mastro's, myself, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Mastro's, but when I used to make, because I worked in the back of the house, when I used to make the potatoes, we would dump sour cream and throw sticks of butter in, and then the big arm would turn, and that's how we would make our mashed potatoes. So you get a pile of mashed potatoes that's about this big on your plate, but if you look there, there's 90 grams of fat, right? There's only 300 calories of actual carbohydrates in the potatoes. The other 850 are coming mostly from fatty acids. Same thing goes for the side of mushrooms. This would be if you just ordered a steak at a restaurant and said, hey, can you put some mushrooms on top of my steak? Once again, there's no Teflon, there's no spray, which means if they want to roast up some mushrooms to put on top of your steak, they're going to do a little bit of oil in a pan, a little bit of garlic, saute them up, and they're going to dump them. The problem is mushrooms just soak up everything that you put them in, right? So if they do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tablespoons, again, you're working with something that has no nonstick surface, you're up to 500, 700 calories that you just put on top of your steak that was also finished in butter and oil. So the two main places that I found that people really need to pay the most attention are the preparation methods of their food at home and the preparation methods of their food at restaurants. It's not so much the food choices for most people that are getting them in trouble, unless you are following something like keto or carnivore or something extreme. But for the average individual, the key is modifying the cooking methods that are used to prepare the food. This kind of goes along with the last part that I just touched on. If you go down and look at the bottom section, asking something as simple as your steak not being prepared in butter, for a lot of you who don't know this, at a steakhouse, the average steak is prepared in 4 tablespoons of butter. It is usually cooked and covered with 2 tablespoons, and then the food runner will usually cover it with another 2 tablespoons before they take it out. That's why your plate is crackling. When you get your plate of steak out, it's crackling like that. That's not just the steak, they added a whole bunch of oil. So by simply doing something like that and swapping out the steak and just saying, hey, can you season it? Can you still grill it normally? Can you just not put any butter on top? You're probably gonna enjoy your steak better, and you can use those 400 calories for whatever you want. Get a couple old fashions, get whatever you want, that you're gonna enjoy a lot more than 400 calories of butter on your steak or 300 calories of butter or whatever it may be. Same thing goes for the mashed potatoes. If you swap out the mashed potatoes that are already pre-made with butter and sour cream and say, can I just get a baked potato and get some whatever you like, chives, cheddar, bacon, whatever, you're only 350, 400 calories instead of the 1100. So now you've got the same plate of food with steak and potatoes, probably gonna enjoy the potato a little more because you're getting it how you want it, and you just saved yourself 640, you just saved 1,000 calories, and you got the exact same type of food. So that's the kind of stuff that I do with my private clients is I kind of say, all right, what does your life look like? Where are you gonna be eating? Where are you gonna be going? How much do you eat with your family? How much do you travel? How much do you do all these things? And really educate them on the places that matter, and then kind of disregard the rest of the stuff that doesn't matter for those people. Continuing with how to avoid extra fats, like I mentioned, even if things are healthy oils, they still add up calorically. So one of the first things I do with all of my clients is I will, based on their intake form, I will set a calorie budget for them, but I encourage them to treat it as just that, a calorie budget. And I don't want them to try and fit anything within it. I just want them to think of it like, I'm gonna give you $2,000, you can spend it on whatever you want. Go nuts. And they do that for 2 weeks. And after they do that for 2 weeks, I have them keep a food diary. Then I go in and examine that food diary, and that's how I then say, all right, go kind of like somebody, like I mentioned, going through your bank account and going down the list and saying, hey, do you need this HBO Max subscription? Do you need this subscription? Do you need this? And people are gonna start to go, oh my God, I didn't even realize I was still paying for that. No, we can lose that. But then you might come across a Massage Envy membership, right? And he goes, hey, do you need to get a massage? And you're like, well, that's really important to me. That's my decompression time for the week, whatever it may be. So you keep that thing, right? But then the cool thing is, by the time you've finished your transformation, you've learned to eat in a way that is conducive with how you already live your life, because we've removed the things that you didn't even really know were causing damage or doing you in. And that's kind of what I do as a job for most of my people. So how can you guys get started today, right? So the number one piece of advice I have for you would be to download MyFitnessPal or something similar. There's MyFitnessPal, there's Lose It. There's a lot of different apps that will keep track of your food intake. I don't want you to become obsessive about it. I don't want you to be crazy. Just keep track of it. Don't try to hit anything. Don't try to do anything. Your only goal would be to keep track of everything that you're eating. And then at the end of 2 weeks, if you can, even if you eat out at a restaurant, it's not gonna look pretty, then it might look pretty bad, but go ahead and put it in. And at the end of the 2 weeks, you will then be able to go and take a look at that data, and you're more than welcome to reach out to me, and I'll be happy to get you on the right track. But you can go yourself and take a look at that data and say, oh my goodness, I had no idea I was consuming this much of this. Because for a lot of people, that's the case when they really start to break things down, because fats are not really visible. Like the potato example I gave you with the mashed potatoes, 800 calories were coming from fat, but you didn't see any of that fat. So a lot of people don't know that they're over-consuming fat because they don't see it in front of them, right? So this allows you to overconsume without really feeling full, and then you just keep eating, and before you know it, you've knocked out 3,000 or 4,000, calories at a sit-down restaurant. Once you do that, that gives you the opportunity to kind of then go in and examine yourself and say, all right, what of these things that I consumed in the last 2 weeks was not worth it? And you're gonna see some outliers. You might be, oh, it was my daughter's birthday, so that's not a normal thing. I'm not gonna do that all the time. And what you should do is then say, is there any place in here that I don't care about getting rid of anything? Is there anything that I can eliminate and not really be too worried about it and not really miss it all that much? And you go in, you eliminate those things, right? Or you replace them with something else. You come up with an alternative swap. And little by little, as we're doing that, we go through, and then before you know it, you've achieved the physical results that you want, you've achieved the internal health results that you want, and you don't really have to change anything at that point, right? Usually when we finish a diet, it's time to go back to eating normal, right? But in this case, the diet has kind of been built as you've been transforming to fit you and your schedule, and that's what makes it sustainable. So that's kind of what I do with people. I know I've still got 10 minutes, but any questions from anyone in the audience? Yes, sir.
Thanks for doing this. The MyFitness app, you get some credit for exercise.
Yes.
Do you believe that that's valid?
It is. It's not accurate. So there's a really interesting. You mean how many calories it gives you?
Yeah, like if I walk the dog 45 minutes,
yeah.
3 miles an hour, I get
X amount of calories. Yeah. So there's some really interesting studies done not only on that algorithm, but on like the Apple Watch as well. And on average, most fitness devices and algorithm calculators like that overestimate it by about 33%. So by about 1/3. Some of the tested devices were off by like 90%, 80%. And the reason that they do this is because they learned really early on that people were more likely to keep using the device if they saw a bigger number get put in, right? Like they felt like, oh, I did more, so I'm gonna keep doing it. So because of that, they have actually modified a lot of their algorithms because the research started to show that if it showed a higher number, people used whatever the device was more. And the same thing has happened with the apps when they populate your numbers. They tend to populate them on the higher side. If you were to go into MyFitnessPal, for instance, and put in all your information, I would suggest putting your weight loss goal around 1 to 1.5 pounds weekly. If you put it any lower than 1.5, it's going to give you a very high calorie number that you should be shooting for that you're probably not going to see a significant amount of loss from. The reason they do that is because they started looking and seeing that if somebody downloaded who was overweight 3 different apps at once, they were most likely to use the one that gave them the most calories. So they, not surprising, they manipulate things kind of on both sides, both on the exercise and on the recommendation of what your food intake should be. But that's a great question. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Hang on one second.
What's your strategy for reducing blood sugar?
So that one's going to be pretty individualized. Obviously, carbohydrates are going to be a little bit lower for somebody who does have elevated A1C already or is a full type 2 diabetic. But I subscribe more so to the theory, and from what I have seen in my own practice, that bringing down overall carbohydrate consumption, it doesn't necessarily need to be a small percentage of your carbohydrates. And the type of carbohydrates also plays a big role, right? So I think a lot of people think, oh, I have elevated A1C, or oh, I have high blood pressure, I need to go on a low carb diet. And it's more so, no, we need to get you eating less carbs than what you're eating right now, and we need to get you eating the right types of carbohydrates, more complex carbohydrates, but it's not always necessarily the solution, and usually, except in extreme cases, not the solution to go to a low carb diet. What I would suggest doing, especially in your case, if you do have elevated A1C or know somebody who does, would be to have them keep track of all their food and see how many grams per day of carbs they are consuming that's leading to elevated A1C. Alcohol can also play a big role in elevated A1C as well. So if there's consistent alcohol consumption, that usually will go hand in hand with that as well. If you feel you're like, not really the kind of person who eats a lot of carbs, I don't really know, oftentimes alcohol consumption can be a big contributor as well.
Hey, Matt.
Yes.
My question pertaining to that alcohol is, what do you advise your clients when it comes to consuming alcohol as far as healthier choices?
So it's really just going to come down to, alcohol should not be something that we're consuming on a regular basis, meaning on like an everyday basis in the first place. It is a toxin that we put in our body. It has a lot of negative effects that go along with it. It's a lot of fun, don't get me wrong. I drink, I like to drink too. But with regards to the type of alcohol, it's actually gonna be more dependent on what you're mixing it with. So the calories in alcohol are completely dependent on the proof, meaning a shot of Jack Daniels has the same calories as a shot of vodka. And a lot of people would not think that. They would think, oh, the dark liquor has more. That's completely false. So the proof of the liquor, if most liquors 80 proof, determines the calories. So then if that's the case, what you really need to look out for is added sugars being added to your drink. A lot of people don't know, for instance, that like a short glass margarita is about 500 to 700 calories, because alcohol is so calorically dense at 7 calories per gram. It has almost as much as straight oil. If you think about olive oil is 9, calories have 7, so it's almost like you're pouring straight oil. And then you add sugar on top of that in the form of simple syrup, in the form of whatever else. Margaritas, Mai Tais, Long Island iced teas can get up to 500 to 800 calories a pop. So if you are gonna drink, I would recommend sticking to things that are more liquor-based, old fashions or vodka sodas or things along those lines, where, look, you're drinking, you're in a social setting, you want to enjoy yourself, you want to unwind a little bit, but don't blow 500 calories on the sugar that's inside your drink when you could either have 3 or 4 other drinks or some food.
Hey, I've got a question about overconsumption of oil calories.
Uh-huh.
And how does that relate to diabetes, or like type 2 diabetes? I mean, does being obese in itself lead to diabetes?
Yes.
Issues with blood sugar?
Yeah, no, so I myself and quite a few people in the dietetics camp have started to move towards more of a belief that obesity is largely driven by, type 2 diabetes is largely driven by obesity and the dampening of the cells that occurs with prolonged obesity rather than simply excess sugar consumption. We all know a lot of like really just rail thin people who seem to just like drink soda and eat whatever they want. They're not type 2 diabetics, right? Like those are never, sometimes they're type 1, right? Sometimes they were born with it. But I subscribe to the theory that prolonged periods of being overweight is going to be what leads to more cases of type 2 diabetes. If you examine any athlete in the world who consumes massive amounts of sugar and carbohydrates, none of them are going to have type 2 diabetes. Why? Because they're burning off as much as what they take in, so they don't have any left over sitting in their bloodstream. Now, if you don't burn off what you take in, what's going to happen? It's going to get turned into body fat. So the carbohydrates need to be relative to the individual. With regards to fatty acids, it's just going to be if it pushes you over your calories, causing you to then walk around with excess adipose tissue, then it can contribute, even if your carbs aren't high, to an increase in type 2 diabetes. Does that answer your question?
I have a question about Ozempic.
Yes, sir.
Seems to be the
I figured somebody would.
What do you think about that?
So when it comes to semaglutide, I'm torn a little bit between it. For the average person, I don't think it is necessary or the correct intervention. If you look at the research studies that we have, because obviously Ozempic, Wegovy, semaglutide, period, is not new. We have weight loss medications that have been around. If you look at the data on weight loss medications, we always see a greater increase following the end of the intervention than we do with nutritional interventions alone. And the reason for that is because something like Ozempic or something like semaglutide is going to blunt your hunger largely. So I'll give you kind of an example. Let's say that somebody's 80 pounds overweight and they're going to go to Thanksgiving this in a few months for their family. And they start taking semaglutide and they're down 40 pounds. The function by which semaglutide works is it slows gastric emptying, at least for the weight loss purpose, not for the diabetes purpose, but for the purpose of weight loss, it slows gastric emptying. So because it slows gastric emptying, your stomach stays full longer, so your ghrelin level, which is your hunger hormone, does not elevate, right? So the problem with that is, let's say you go to Thanksgiving and you're already down 40 pounds. And you, oh my goodness, you look amazing. Everyone's telling you how great you look. And you're like, okay, but I'm taking Ozempic, and because it really slows down how quickly I digest food, I can't really eat that much. So please just don't push a whole lot of food on me, right? So because of that, you avoid all the social pressures this year during Thanksgiving, right? And you avoid all the cravings because you're not hungry because there's a bunch of food in your stomach. The problem becomes when you finish losing the 80 pounds and next Thanksgiving rolls around, and now you look all thin like all your family members and everybody else, and they go, oh, come on, you couldn't have anything last Thanksgiving, just enjoy yourself. You haven't really learned how to navigate any of the things. And to Patrick's point, you almost exacerbate the yo-yo. You almost make the yo-yo worse. So I'm a big fan of it for two people. People who are either going to include some sort of nutritional intervention alongside it so that they can learn some of those same tools, or people who are severely obese, who I work with, who are 500, 600, 700 plus pounds, who have what is considered true food addiction, where they literally, it's a compulsion that they have. Those are the two cases that if you're willing to still go through the education as you're taking it and it's helping you, then as long as that education is being, foundationally laid down, you should be able to keep it off afterwards. And it can be a great kickstart for some people to get them going. But for the average person, the nutritional intervention alone, if it's done with the right person in the right way, that should not be necessary. And I'm one of those people who's like, if we don't have to take a drug, let's avoid taking the drug. Let's see if we can get it without it. But for some people, it does work well as kind of a kickstart. And then, like I mentioned, for those other populations, it can be beneficial. Yeah.
Last question, I guess. What are your thoughts about intermittent fasting?
So IF is totally fine. IF falls under the category of what I define as an unnecessary complexity. So intermittent fasting, you can do it if you would like. It's not going to have any negative effect on you whatsoever. However, fasting for 16 hours or even for 20 hours has not been shown to have the same increases in improvements in gut bacteria, improvements in IGF-1, improvements in HGH that things like 36 and 48-hour fasts have, right? Shorter term fasting does not produce the same changes to the gut microbiome. Short-term fasting definitely does not produce changes to IGF-1. We need to reach much longer periods of fasting. So you can do it, and I have a lot of clients who do it because it automatically sets parameters for them to fall within, but it's not gonna help you. If I don't do intermittent fasting and I eat the same number of calories as you and you do it, you're not gonna get some magical benefit. The reason it worked so well for so long is because if you only give somebody 8 hours out of the day to eat, well, they're going to eat less food than the guy who has 24 hours out of the day to eat, right? The other thing it did automatically, and I know I'm running out of time, so I'll wrap it up, but the other thing it does automatically is most people end their window after dinner, right? Their window starts at 12 and it ends at 8. So it's like from lunch to dinner, that's their window. Well, when do most of us overeat? After dinner, while we sit there and watch Netflix, right? So if you put a hard window on yourself, mechanistically, the IF is not producing anything inside here, but because you've put the parameter on yourself of only being able to eat for 8 hours, of course you're gonna eat less than the person who can eat for 24 hours. I won't go into it because I know I got to get off here, but there was a really interesting study in New England Journal of Medicine about 6 months ago that for the first time controlled both groups and said you guys both have to adhere to the same calorie deficit, and all of the IF benefits that had previously been purported by the other studies that were less controlled just went out the window. So you can do it if you want, it's not gonna hurt you. And if you find that it personally helps you, then keep doing it, but you're not gonna have any greater weight loss just because you're doing it than someone else.
Quick question. Sorry.
No, you're good.
What do you think about methodology and theory about ranking foods by glycemic count? Like specializing, taking more of the ones with a lower glycemic count.
By what count? I'm so sorry.
Glycemic count.
Oh, I completely am opposed to it. Yeah, there's absolutely no reason to take glycemic count into account, with glycemic index into account unless you are a full type 2 diabetic who needs to manage their blood glucose. There is way too much emphasis placed on the glycemic index when overall calorie intake will trump the glycemic index. If you don't overconsume calorically, you can't push yourself to a point. It would be like is it going to cause a more severe insulin spike? Yes. Does insulin store fat? Yes. But if you don't have an excess of calories left over at the end of the day, you can't store anything. So it would be, let's say I eat a bag of gummy worms before I go to bed, but I didn't exceed my calories for that day. I'm still going to lose weight, right? And the reason for that is because I don't have any money to put in the bank. I don't have anything to store. Just because something has a high glycemic index and produces a heavy insulin response, which might produce a heavy fat storage response, if I don't have any energy left, then if I've burned it all off, via whatever means that may be, it's not going to have any negative impact. Otherwise, every single athlete who drinks Gatorade and who drinks every other sweetened beverage would end up with type 2 diabetes. But they don't, they burn it off. We just need to find what your equivalent for that is, because you're probably not doing 8-hour practices every day, right? So you got to find what that individual's tolerance is for that nutrient. But otherwise, every single athlete on the planet would have type 2 diabetes if the glycemic index could, even in the presence of a calorie deficit, cause type 2 diabetes in and of itself.
Could you meet us at the buffet table?
And tell you guys what to eat. You can have some of that and have some of that. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Patrick. Thank you, everybody.